Welcome! Today we're jumping into the first 9 verses of Isaiah chapter 10. And this is a really fascinating passage. It kicks off with this fiery judgment against corrupt leaders, but then it takes a wild turn, revealing how a brutal empire becomes a tool, an unwitting instrument in a divine plan. So let's break down how this whole story of justice and irony unfolds, verse by verse. Right out of the gate, the first word sets the tone. Woe. Now, our source material makes it clear this isn't just, an expression of sadness. This is a formal declaration of impending doom. It's a judgment, and it's aimed directly at the nation's leaders, putting them squarely in the crosshairs. And it's really important to get this. Verses 1 through 4 aren't starting a brand new thought. Our source material tells us this is actually a direct continuation of the judgment that started back in chapter 9. God is just methodically laying out the case, explaining exactly why this judgment is coming for the leadership of Israel and Judah. So what was their big crime? Well, verse 1 says they decree unrighteous decrees. We're not talking about simple mistakes in policy here. Nope. The leaders are deliberately crafting laws, putting stuff on the books for one reason and one reason only, to legally rig the system for the rich so they can systematically crush the poor. Think about that. They're using the law itself to create injustice. And verse 2 gets even more specific. It spells out exactly who becomes the prey when the law itself is the predator. The targets are the needy, the poor, widows, and the fatherless, basically orphans. In that society, these were the people with the absolute least social power. And our source points out that this is what makes the crime so offensive to God. The very judges who were supposed to protect the vulnerable have turned into their biggest oppressors. It just shows how completely rotten the system had become. Then verse 3 hits these corrupt leaders with this haunting rhetorical question. What are you going to do on Judgment Day? That phrase, desolation which shall come from far, well, that's a direct reference to the coming invasion by Assyria. And the word glory? That's all their stolen wealth, the treasure, the power, everything they built by exploiting people. So the verse is basically saying, hey, when the Assyrian army's at your gates, who are you going to run to then? Where are you going to hide all that precious glory? And then, at the end of verse 4, we get this chilling line again. According to our source, this is the fourth time this exact phrase shows up. It's tying this specific sin of unjust laws back to all the other charges from chapter 9, their pride, their hypocrisy, even their internal fighting. It's this powerful refrain that says, yep, all these sins are connected, and the judgment for them is still coming. Okay, this brings us to a huge shift in the chapter. The judgment has been declared, the reasons have been given. Now, in verse 5, God introduces the actual instrument he's going to use to carry it all out. The text calls Assyria the rod of mine anger. So, what in the world does that mean? Well, a rod is a tool, right? It's an instrument you'd use for correction or for punishment. In this context, God is basically declaring that he is picking up the entire brutal Assyrian empire and is going to wield it like a club to bring judgment on his own people. And this isn't some one-off event. Our source points out that this is a theme you see again and again in the Bible. For instance, God used Assyria to judge Israel. Later on, he used Babylon to judge Judah. And he even used Cyrus of Persia, a pagan king, to restore Israel. It shows this pattern of God using entire nations, often without them even knowing it, to accomplish his purposes on the world stage. So God has his instrument, Assyria. Now in verse 6, he gives this rod its specific marching orders and points it right at its target. The target is a hypocritical nation. So who's that? Our source connects this straight back to Isaiah 9, verse 17, which says, "For everyone is a hypocrite and an evildoer." The hypocritical nation is Israel. They're being judged for condemning the very same sins in other people that they themselves were committing. It's this profound, almost poetic justice. The standard they used on others is now being used to judge them. Now, this is where the source material we're using draws a line from this ancient charge of hypocrisy to a modern event. It's really important for me to be clear here. What I'm about to share is the specific analysis and analogy that is presented in our source. Our source uses the attacks of October 7th, 2023 as its example. The author makes the case that a form of hypocrisy was shown in the global reaction. The source's argument is this. While Israel's military response received widespread condemnation, the initial acts committed by Hamas were not condemned with that same level of consistency. To back up this viewpoint, the source material goes into detail about specific atrocities from that day, presenting what it sees as a double standard, a modern parallel to the hypocritical judgment that Isaiah is talking about. But here's where the passage pulls off an incredible twist. Just as God is commissioning his instrument, the camera sort of pivots to the mindset of the instrument itself. And this is where the irony gets so deep, because Assyria has absolutely no idea it's just a tool. Verse 7 just lays out the massive difference in their plans. Speaking about the Assyrian king, it says, "Howbeit he meaneth not so." See, God intends to use Assyria for a very specific, limited mission: judge Israel. But the king's plan, the verse says his goal is to destroy and cut off nations, not a few. He's driven by nothing but his own ambition for an empire. He is completely, totally unaware that he's just a pawn in a divine game he can't even see. The next few verses give us a front row seat to the king's own arrogant thoughts. In verse 8, he actually boasts, "Are not my princes altogether kings?" His pride is so off the charts that he sees his own commanders, his generals, as being on the same level as the kings of the nations he's conquered. I mean, that's not just confidence. That's a statement of absolute, crushing dominance. And our explainer for today ends with the king's boast in verse 9. He just rattles off the list of cities he's conquered: Calno, Carchemish, Damascus, and then he just sneeringly throws Samaria, Israel's capital, in with the rest. To him, they're all the same. They're just trophies, another notch on his belt. And it's this supreme arrogance, this total blindness to any power greater than his own, that is going to set the stage for his own spectacular downfall. And that leaves us with one final powerful question. What happens when the instrument begins to believe it's the master?